June 5, 1944. The night was thick, with a cold mist rolling off the English Channel, and the beaches of Normandy waited silently, as if holding their breath for the dawn. In a small Allied command bunker near Portsmouth, Captain Michael Harris studied the maps spread across the table, his brow furrowed under the dim light of the lantern. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans had strengthened their coastal defenses, laying mines, barbed wires, and sniper nests across every potential landing site. Harris knew that tomorrow would be a day that could decide the war, or end him. Harris had been with the 2nd Infantry Division for over 2 years, fighting in North Africa and Italy. He had seen men fall in the sand, heard the cries of the wounded, and smelled the acrid smoke of burning towns. Yet nothing had prepared him for the enormity of what lay ahead, leading men into the jaws of a fortified coastline, where every step could be the last. Outside, the harbor hummed with activity. Ships laden with troops and equipment rocked gently on the waves. Soldiers whispered prayers, wrote hurried letters home, or stared silently at the dark water, trying to imagine the world beyond the next few hours. Among them was Private Tommy Reynolds, a farm boy from Iowa who had traded plows for rifles, dreaming of heroism and glory, unaware that the night might steal both. In the command bunker, Harris met with Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Briggs, his superior. "Tomorrow," Briggs said, his voice low and measured, "we face the strongest German defenses in Europe. They expect us, they know our tactics. But we've got something they don't: surprise, determination, and the courage of our men." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Stay close to your men, Harris. Lead them, or they'll fall without you." Harris nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Leadership was never just about orders. It was about carrying the fear of hundreds while keeping your own buried. He reviewed the beach maps again, noting the red markers: mines, pillboxes, machine gun nests, artillery positions. The thought of what awaited them churned his stomach, but he forced himself to focus. Every detail could mean life or death tomorrow. Meanwhile, across the Channel in occupied France, German General Karl von Richter inspected the defenses at Omaha Beach. A tall, imposing man with icy blue eyes, he paced the cliffside, his sharp gaze tracing the shadows below. Von Richter had built his reputation on meticulous planning and ruthless efficiency. "They will come at dawn," he muttered to his staff. "And when they do, they will break. Make sure nothing survives." As the night deepened, Allied planes flew overhead, their engines muffled by the distance. Paratroopers were being dropped behind enemy lines, some landing far from their designated zones, cut off and surrounded by German patrols. Among them was Sergeant James O'Connor, tasked with destroying communications to delay reinforcements. The young men clutched their rifles tightly, hearts pounding, wondering if this would be their last jump, their last breath. Back on the ships, soldiers packed into landing crafts waited silently. Waves rocked the hulls as men whispered to one another, clinging to memories of home. Some prayed, some laughed nervously, trying to mask the terror that gnawed at their resolve. Tommy Reynolds, gripping his rifle, thought of his mother's last words: "Come back, my boy. You are braver than you know." The thought brought him both comfort and pain. The sea ahead seemed endless, unforgiving. As midnight approached, Harris made his final rounds. He spoke to each platoon leader, giving instructions, reminders, and encouragement. "Remember your training," he said. "Keep your eyes open, trust your brothers beside you, and never lose hope." He paused at the edge of the deck, staring at the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, enemy soldiers slept, unaware that in just a few hours, their calm would shatter. Meanwhile, lightning cracked across the stormy sky. The wind howled, sending cold sprays of seawater over the deck. Harris knew the weather could delay the landing or scatter their forces. Yet, despite the danger, the men would charge forward. They had to. For the freedom of Europe, for the countless lives under occupation, they would face death without flinching. Hours passed. Soldiers huddled in the landing crafts, checking their equipment, whispering final words to comrades, or staring silently at the dark water ahead. The tension was almost unbearable. Somewhere, a bugle sounded. followed by the faint strains of a military hymn. Harris, standing tall despite exhaustion, felt the weight of responsibility crushing him, yet a spark of determination burned in his chest. Tomorrow, he would lead his men onto the beaches of Normandy. Tomorrow, the world would change forever. As the first hints of dawn painted the horizon, the soldiers braced themselves. Waves crashed against the hulls, and the engines roared to life. The time had come. Captain Harris glanced at his watch. 6:15. Orders had been given, plans set, and men ready. Beyond the mist, beyond the roaring sea, lay the beaches defended by men who would not surrender easily. And yet, Harris felt no fear, only the solemn awareness of duty. His thoughts flicked to Tommy, to Sergeant O'Connor, to every man who had placed their trust in him. "Stay alive," he whispered silently. "Do your part. We can make it." The landing craft surged forward, slicing through the waves toward the fortified shores of Normandy. The horizon slowly revealed the outlines of enemy positions, the jagged silhouettes of bunkers, and the glint of machine gun barrels. Somewhere, the first shots would ring out, and the chaos of battle would begin. Captain Harris tightened his grip on his rifle, inhaled deeply, and stepped forward. Tomorrow, history would remember this day. But for now, all that mattered was survival, and the courage to face the storm that waited beyond the water. The storm was coming, and with it, the tide of destiny. June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m. The first rays of dawn barely pierced the thick mist hovering over Omaha Beach. Captain Michael Harris gripped his rifle tightly as the landing craft lurched forward, the cold spray of the channel stinging his face. Around him, the men were tense, silent, clutching their weapons and silently praying. Some whispered last words to family, some stared into the gray waves, and some, like Private Tommy Reynolds, swallowed their fear and prepared to leap into hell. Suddenly, a deafening roar shattered the morning calm. German artillery and machine guns erupted from the bunkers along the cliffs. Explosions rocked the landing crafts, throwing men off balance, splintering wood, and sending seawater spraying into faces. Harris felt the shockwave against his chest and stumbled, regaining his footing in time to shout orders. "Keep your heads down. Move forward on my command." Bullets tore through the air like deadly hornets. Men fell, screaming, some trying to pull comrades to safety, others frozen in terror. Harris pushed forward, urging his platoon to disembark. He leapt from the craft into waist-deep water, the weight of his equipment dragging him, the sand beneath shifting with every step. Around him, chaos unfolded, men screaming, guns firing, smoke rising from explosions, the screams of the wounded cutting through the roar of battle. Tommy Reynolds fought to keep moving. A shell exploded nearby, sending a shock wave that knocked him off his feet. He landed in the sand, coughing, blood from a shallow cut stinging his eyes. Harris grabbed him roughly by the shoulder. "Up. We move." "No stopping now," he yelled, firing at a machine gun nest perched atop a cliff. Tommy scrambled, adrenaline surging, and followed Harris toward a narrow break in the barbed wire. The beach was a nightmare of twisted metal, shattered wood, and bodies. Smoke and dust mingled with the salty mist, making it almost impossible to see. German snipers picked off soldiers with deadly precision, hiding behind crumbled walls and sandbags. Harris signaled a small group to flank a pillbox, knowing that if it was not neutralized, dozens of men would die trying to cross the beach. Sergeant James O'Connor, who had been dropped behind enemy lines hours earlier, fought through dense hedgerows to reach the German communications post. Explosions echoed around him as he planted charges on a telephone junction, cutting off the flow of reinforcements for a precious few minutes. Those few minutes were all Harris needed to advance his men further inland. Amid the chaos, Harris spotted a wounded soldier struggling in the sand, pinned by debris. Without hesitation, he sprinted through open fire, dragging the man to safety, bullets ripping through the air around him. Every step was a fight for survival, every breath a miracle. "We survived together," he shouted, pushing his platoon forward. The tide of men slowly crept up the beach. Explosions tore craters in the sand, scattering the injured and disoriented. Tommy saw friends he had trained with fall beside him, but he forced himself to keep moving. Survival demanded it. Courage demanded it. At the top of the cliffs, General Karl von Richter watched through binoculars. "They will break," he said coldly. Yet, even he could sense the determination, the sheer human will propelling the soldiers forward. Harris and his men were not just advancing, they were surviving, adapting, improvising under relentless fire. By mid-morning, Harris's platoon had reached the first line of German defenses. Barbed wire and minefields slowed their progress, but they pressed on. With hand grenades and carefully aimed fire, they dismantled the positions one by one. Every bunker was a battlefield, every step forward a small victory. Tommy, exhausted and bloodied, took down a sniper perched on a ridge, saving a fellow soldier. He didn't feel like a hero, he felt like a man barely holding on. Harris moved among his men, shouting encouragement, firing when necessary, dragging the wounded to relative safety. Sergeant O'Connor rejoined them after destroying the communications post, bringing crucial intelligence about enemy movements. With the reinforcements delayed, Harris's platoon gained a small, yet vital, foothold on the beach. By late afternoon, the tide of battle had begun to shift. Allied forces poured onto the beaches, overwhelming some German positions. But victory came at a terrible cost. Many brave men lay dead or injured, their screams still echoing in Harris's mind. Yet the momentum was with them, and for the first time that day, Harris allowed himself a brief flicker of hope. Exhausted, bloodied, but unbroken, Harris and his men took shelter behind the remnants of a destroyed bunker. The smoke hung thick, and the distant sound of artillery and gunfire continued relentlessly. Harris looked at Tommy and the others, seeing fear, courage, and determination etched into their faces. "We made it this far," he said, his voice hoarse. "Tomorrow we push further. For our brothers, for freedom." As night fell over the bloodied sands of Normandy, the first battle was over, but the war was far from won. Harris knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horrors, and more sacrifices. Yet in the quiet moments between the gunfire, he also saw something else: resilience. Humanity refusing to break under fire. And somewhere in the mist and shadows, the tide of destiny continued to move. The storm had arrived, but so had the courage of men determined to survive, to fight, and to change the course of history. June 7, 1944. The sun rose over Normandy, painting the smoke-laden battlefield in hues of gray and orange. The morning air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder, charred wood, and salt from the Channel. Captain Michael Harris and his platoon had survived the first day's horrors on Omaha Beach, but the true test was just beginning. Inland lay the enemy's strongholds, hedgerows, villages, and artillery positions that could shred a man with a single well-aimed shell. Harris gathered his platoon near a shattered farmhouse, using the ruins for cover. The men were exhausted, bruised, and bloodied, yet their eyes burned with determination. "Listen up," Harris said, pointing to the map etched with chalk marks on the dirt floor. "We move through the hedgerows. Small units, coordinated fire, and keep your heads down. The Germans know we're coming. They'll try to stop us at every turn." Private Tommy Reynolds tightened the straps on his pack, feeling every ache in his body. His uniform was soaked in mud and blood, and blisters had formed on his hands from gripping his rifle all night. Yet he followed Harris's lead, moving silently with the rest of the platoon through the shattered fields. Every hedgerow was a potential ambush. Every shadow could hide a sniper. Every sound, a cracking branch, a distant shout, made their hearts leap. Sergeant James O'Connor scouted ahead, weaving through the tall grass and broken hedges. He had already learned the bitter lesson that in Normandy, no position was truly safe. Enemy machine guns and mortars could erupt without warning, and soldiers could vanish within seconds. Yet he moved with confidence, relaying positions to Harris, marking the safest routes forward. As the platoon advanced, the first German counterattack struck. From behind a crumbling stone wall, enemy soldiers opened fire with automatic rifles. Harris dove to the ground, returning fire, signaling his men to take cover. Explosions rocked the ground nearby, sending dirt and shrapnel flying into faces. Tommy froze for a moment as a grenade landed near him, the blast knocking him sideways into the mud. He scrambled up, heart pounding, realizing that hesitation meant death here. Harris rallied his men, moving from cover to cover, throwing grenades into enemy positions, and leading a small group to flank the attackers. The firefight was intense and chaotic, bullets whizzing past, soldiers shouting, smoke filling the air. Harris felt the sting of a graze on his shoulder, but ignored it, focusing on keeping his men alive. One by one, they took out the enemy positions, securing a small clearing. By mid-morning, they reached the outskirts of a village partially destroyed by Allied bombardment. The streets were littered with rubble, burned vehicles, and abandoned equipment. Harris signaled for caution. Every building could be a trap. Windows hid snipers, basements concealed machine guns, and alleyways could funnel men into deadly crossfire. Tommy and a few others entered a half-collapsed house to search for supplies and cover. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the metallic scent of blood. They found ammunition, a few medical kits, and a wounded German soldier. Harris argued over whether to take him prisoner or leave him, weighing the risk of slowing their advance against their duty as soldiers. They chose mercy, tying him up and leaving him under guard while continuing their mission. The village was only partially secured when German reinforcements arrived from the rear. Tanks rumbled across the fields, their treads crushing everything in their path. Harris watched helplessly as artillery shells tore into buildings, sending wood and stone flying. Fall back, he shouted, directing his men toward a small ditch that offered some protection. The platoon scrambled, covering one another, as German tanks advanced closer. O'Connor ran ahead to place explosives along a narrow bridge, knowing it was the only route the enemy could take without being slowed. The charges detonated just as the lead tank crossed, sending it rolling into the muddy canal below. The explosion bought precious minutes, but Harris knew they were far from safe. The Germans would regroup and press the attack. By late afternoon, the platoon had secured a temporary position behind a ridge overlooking the village. Men huddled in small groups, tending to wounds, reloading weapons, and catching brief moments of breath. Harris took stock of his platoon. More than half were injured, yet the men remained vigilant. "We hold here tonight," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Tomorrow we push further. We take the next village, and then the next. Keep your eyes open. Trust each other. That's all we have." Tommy sat beside a smoldering fire, staring at the horizon. He thought of his family back in Iowa, of his mother's face, and of the promise he had made to survive. Around him, men whispered prayers or stared silently, grappling with the horrors they had witnessed. Yet, even in the darkness, a bond had formed, a brotherhood forged in the fire of battle. Night fell over Normandy, and the battlefield became eerily quiet. Harris walked among his men, checking on the wounded and giving words of encouragement. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of German tanks reminded them that danger was never far. Sleep was impossible. Rest was fleeting. But they had survived the first 2 days of hell, and that survival fueled their resolve. Captain Harris knew the fight was far from over. German counterattacks would continue, and the path to liberation would be soaked in blood. Yet, he also knew that the courage of ordinary men, farmers, students, laborers, could turn the tide. Every step inland, every victory over enemy positions, was a step toward freedom. As dawn approached, Harris looked toward the horizon, where the sun would rise again over a war-torn land. He felt the weight of responsibility, the burden of command, and the hope that his men could carry him through the trials ahead. The heart of fire had been entered, and the battle for Normandy was only beginning. June 8, 1944. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the fields of Normandy, obscuring the ruined villages and shattered roads. Captain Michael Harris and his platoon had spent the night behind a ridge, patching wounds, rationing water, and catching what little rest they could. Every man knew that the calm was temporary. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of German artillery and the hiss of mortars promised that the enemy was planning a counterattack. Harris reviewed the maps, noting positions of remaining German forces. The village they had secured was strategically vital. Holding it meant disrupting enemy supply lines and providing a staging point for the Allied advance. But it was isolated, surrounded by open fields and hidden pockets of enemy troops. "We need eyes everywhere," Harris said to Sergeant James O'Connor. "Scout the east flank and watch the hedgerows. They'll come at us hard." By mid-morning, the first signs of the counterattack appeared. German soldiers emerged from the ruined barns and hedgerows, advancing in small, calculated units. Mortar shells pounded the perimeter, sending men diving for cover. Harris called out orders, positioning his men behind walls, ditches, and overturned carts. "Hold your fire until they're close," he shouted. "We make every shot count." Private Tommy Reynolds' heart raced as he fired at the advancing enemy. The smoke and chaos made it hard to see anything clearly, and each explosion shook the ground beneath him. Yet, despite his fear, he fought with a determination born of survival. Around him, men were falling, but retreat was not an option. Survival demanded courage. Sergeant O'Connor, moving ahead through the broken hedgerows, spotted a German squad trying to flank their position. He fired rapidly, signaling Harris and Tommy to cover the open side. Harris moved quickly to reinforce the weak point, throwing grenades into enemy positions while leading a small group to intercept the attackers. Every second was a battle for life, every step a confrontation with death. As the battle raged, Harris noticed a German officer coordinating the enemy troops from a vantage point atop a destroyed building. Realizing the officer's elimination could disrupt the assault, Harris formulated a daring plan. He signaled Tommy and O'Connor to follow him. Crawling through mud and debris, they approached the building under a hail of bullets. Tommy felt his hands trembling but pressed on, trusting his captain and training. Reaching the base of the ruined structure, Harris lobbed a grenade into the building. The explosion tore through the upper floor, sending the German officer tumbling down. The sudden disruption threw the enemy into confusion, buying Harris's platoon crucial time. Using this advantage, they pushed back the attackers, securing their position for the moment. But the cost was heavy. Many of their comrades were dead or wounded. The platoon had been pushed to its limits, yet the men refused to give in. Harris moved among them, shouting encouragement, tending to the wounded, and organizing defenses for the inevitable next assault. "This is what courage looks like," he said quietly to Tommy, who was reloading his rifle with shaking hands. "It's not the absence of fear, it's fighting despite it." By late afternoon, Allied reinforcements began to arrive, pushing the Germans back further. Tanks rumbled across the fields, providing cover fire and lifting morale. Yet Harris knew that the battle for Normandy was far from over. Each village, each hedgerow, each ridge would be contested fiercely. They had survived the crucible, but tomorrow would demand even more. Tommy sat beside a small fire, bandaging his bleeding hands. He looked around at his fellow soldiers, seeing exhaustion, pain, and yet a fierce determination in their eyes. Bonds had formed, unspoken but unbreakable. They were no longer just a platoon, they were brothers in arms. Sergeant O'Connor joined him, sharing a wordless nod of mutual respect. In these moments, the horrors of war were overshadowed by the strength of camaraderie. As night fell, the battlefield was quiet again, but the tension was palpable. Harris walked among his men, checking defenses, rationing supplies, and keeping a vigilant eye on the darkened horizon. Somewhere beyond the fog, the enemy was regrouping, planning their next strike. But Harris knew that his men, though weary, were ready to face whatever came. In the quiet hours before dawn, Harris thought of the sacrifices made so far, the friends lost, the families left behind, the innocence shattered by the relentless march of war. Yet he also felt hope. Every life saved, every position held, every act of bravery was a step toward victory. And in that hope, he found the strength to lead, to inspire, and to survive. The storm of battle was far from over. The crucible of courage would continue to test them, shaping men into warriors, and forging legends from ordinary souls. Harris, Tommy, O'Connor, and the men of their platoon had faced fire and emerged alive, but the next day would demand even more. The tide of destiny was relentless, and Normandy was only the beginning. June 9, 1944. The morning air was thick with smoke, dust, and the metallic scent of blood. Normandy had become a crucible of fire, mud, and courage. Captain Michael Harris stood on the ridge overlooking the village they had fought for 3 days to secure. The remnants of enemy forces were scattered, some fleeing, some regrouping for desperate last-ditch attacks. Harris knew this would be the decisive push. Either they held the village completely, or the cost of failure would be unbearable. "Men," Harris called out to his platoon, voice hoarse but commanding, "today we finish what we started. We push them out, secure every street, every house, and ensure no enemy remains. Stay sharp. Watch each other's backs. We move together or we don't move at all." Private Tommy Reynolds tightened his helmet straps, staring at the destroyed buildings, the shattered vehicles, and the cratered streets. He had never imagined such destruction in his life, yet the resolve inside him had grown stronger with every firefight, every fallen comrade. He glanced at Sergeant O'Connor, who gave a firm nod. They were ready. The attack began at dawn. Harris led the platoon down the ridge, advancing cautiously through the ruined streets. German snipers still lurked in upper windows and shattered roofs. Harris signaled Tommy and another soldier to provide covering fire, while he and O'Connor cleared the first building. They moved silently, but when the door was breached, chaos erupted. Bullets ricocheted, explosions shook the floor, and smoke choked the air. Harris threw grenades, firing his rifle with precision. O'Connor subdued the remaining soldiers in the building, dragging one unconscious German outside. Tommy, pinned behind rubble, took careful shots, saving a comrade who had been exposed. Every act was small but vital. Every move meant survival. By mid-morning, they had cleared several key positions in the village, but the Germans launched a sudden counteroffensive, desperate to reclaim what they had lost. Tanks rolled in from the east, and machine gun fire raked the streets. Harris realized they were nearly surrounded. He called for artillery support and signaled to flank the tanks using a narrow alleyway. Tommy followed him, adrenaline surging through his veins. The streets became a blur of smoke, flame, and gunfire. Harris hurled a grenade at a German machine gun nest, silencing it, while Tommy provided cover fire for the advancing men. O'Connor moved swiftly, throwing makeshift Molotov cocktails to force enemy troops from cover. Amid the chaos, Harris spotted a wounded comrade pinned under debris. Without hesitation, he rushed into open fire, dragging the man to safety while bullets tore the ground around him. It was a moment of raw heroism, witnessed by Tommy, who felt both fear and awe. Courage, Harris had shown them, was not the absence of fear. It was action despite it. By late afternoon, the last German resistance crumbled. The tanks that had advanced from the east were disabled, their crews either captured or dead. Harris's platoon had held the village, but the cost was immense. Bodies of fallen soldiers lay among the rubble, and cries of the wounded echoed through the streets. Tommy knelt beside O'Connor, helping bandage injuries and consoling those who had lost friends. As the sun set, casting a fiery glow over the battlefield, Harris gathered his platoon for a moment of quiet reflection. "We did it," he said softly, voice heavy with exhaustion. "We've taken this village. We've survived together. But remember, this victory is only part of the journey. Others will follow, and we must be ready." Tommy looked around at his fellow soldiers. Faces were smeared with blood and dirt, eyes filled with exhaustion, yet a spark of pride burned in each one. They had faced death, chaos, and fear, and had emerged alive. Bonds forged in battle had turned men into brothers, and ordinary soldiers into legends. Night fell over Normandy, and the village lay silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the crackle of small fires. Harris walked the perimeter, keeping watch even as exhaustion tugged at him. Somewhere in the distance, the tide of war continued, But for now, they had claimed a foothold in history. Private Tommy Reynolds finally allowed himself to sit, staring at the horizon. He thought of home, of family, and of the friends lost along the way. He realized that survival was not enough. Courage, sacrifice, and unity were what defined them. And though the war would continue, the victory today was a testament to the human spirit, unyielding, brave, and relentless. Captain Harris, standing beside him, watched the sky darken. "We've done what few could," he said. "Remember this. Remember each other. And never forget that courage, even in the face of death, can change the course of history." As the night settled over Normandy, the battlefield finally quieted. The storm had passed, leaving behind scars and memories, heroism and loss. Tomorrow, the fight would continue, but for now, in the aftermath of fire and blood, men like Harris, Tommy, and O'Connor had carved their names into the story of the Second World War. The dawn of victory had arrived, and with it, the hope of freedom, the courage of men, and the enduring reminder that even in the darkest hours, humanity could shine brightest.